I'm going to wait a few minutes to see if anyone joins. All right. Okay. So today we're going to talk about access modifiers, or we're going to talk about them again. We've had a few sessions where we've talked about them, but there are some. I saw some questions and and some mistakes that people had made in what they were turning in. Also, I could always use a brush up. It's pretty similar. Access modifiers are pretty similar to them in C++, but there are some subtle differences. And so we'll talk about those. And then we're going to go through and fix or update the previous activities that we've worked on in sessions. The code may work, and we'll explain why. But really it should be fixed so that it's or updated to properly be using the access modifiers. Okay. So yeah, I would just everything's good in Jeffland, I assume. Enable SSHN. Assume this website's good. Website looks good. Okay. And hopefully you've done assignment 5 and working on 6 and such. And then send me a message if you have any requests for sessions. Okie dokie. Let's talk about access control. So whenever we make a class or any of its members, which that may include variables or methods that belong to that class, we have to set the access modifiers for who can use them, or who can access them, who can change them, and whatnot. So so let's just go through. So we haven't really talked about packages yet, but just know that you can group files of code together, separate .java files together to be in a common package, and you can set the permissions, the access control for packages specifically, and we'll see that. Okay, so classes. Hopefully we've seen classes since day one. In Java, everything is inside of a class. That's not the case in some other languages, but in Java, everybody's inside of a class, and the class is typically the file name. And then you can have inner classes or subclasses. And then there's sort of the world, any code that's external to your class or your package or your subclass. So for example, Jeff's robot is considered to be in the world, even though his robot reads your .java file and maybe it makes some predictions about that and grades you based on that. It also, when it's running the tests, it typically runs the tests in this world scope here. Okay. And then these are the modifiers. So hopefully you've seen at least public and private, and you may have seen protected when you were reading some of the Java documentation, when you were reading some of the classes like scanner or whatnot, you might have seen some things marked as protected. So public, everybody can see it. We can see it. The class can see it, the package can see it, the subclass, and the world can see it. If you say protected, it's essentially everybody except for the world. So protected is nice if you want to be able to share it amongst all of your code, but then any code that's external to your code, and I'm saying your code in quotes, but essentially in that project that you're working in, you would group everything in your project, you would group everything in the same kind of package, and there might be subclasses in that project. So everything that's sort of your code or the project that you're working on, maybe you're working on a project with other people, would have access to the protected members, but anything external to that would not have access to anything protected. And then no modifier, this is the tricky one. If you forget to specify a modifier, or you intentionally leave it off, you're gonna get something called package private. So yeah, no modifier is also package private. And so that's what tripped up a lot of people, is that package private is not public. It's close by it's 50% of the way if we look, because if you forget the modifier, it will become package private, and then it will work for everything inside of your class. So for example, if you have a main inside of your class, your main will be able to access everything and will be able to modify everything, and that will be fine. And if you have a package, if you have like a project, everything will be able to access it. But then the moment Jeff's robot goes to test it, because he's in the world, oh, I should probably turn on the pointer. There we go. Because he's in the world, it can't see it, or it gets, permission denied or whatever. And that's it. He's not able to grade your class based, or your member functions or methods, because it can't see them. So yeah, no modifier or package private is probably not what you want. But that's why occasionally some things will work if you forget to put a modifier, because if you're doing everything inside of your own class, it's going to be package private and you're going to have access to it. Okie dokie. And then there's private. So private, only things inside of your own class can access private things. So typically all of your members, your member variables, would be private, and then maybe some helper functions or helper methods. If you have something that helps you do some kind of internal working, but that you don't want anybody outside of your program to call it, you would want to make that private too. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, so private, everything inside can access it, but everything outside, even the package. So if you had another class that was in the same project, but you didn't want it to access it, you use private. So there you go. And this article is pretty good. Pull it up. So they explain, they have the same, I just stole this from them, but they have a pretty good explanation of what all of this is, and pretty pictures. Okay, so yeah, I would recommend going there and reading through that if what I said was not clear. But essentially, anything that you want everybody to be able to access, you make public. And then anything that you want your project to be able to access, you make protected. And then the no modifier or package private, you might use. I would say package private. If you wanted this no modifier behavior, you should probably say package private. But very rarely do you want this no modifier. If you were to use something that had this kind of permissions, you would probably use protected, because just excluding this subclass most of the time doesn't really make sense if you want something to be accessible by everybody. Okay, and then yeah, so most of the time you're going to use this public and this private, but occasionally in big projects where you're sharing resources back and forth, you might use this this protected a bit. Okie dokie. So let's take a look at some of the examples that we've done before and see how we can update them or fix them. So So yeah, okay. So let's look at our Pokemon class, because that one at least we did it right. So here the class doesn't have one. So actually we should probably add public to that. But the constructors, the getters, and the setters, good. Battle, which isn't written yet, and then main. And then here's our privates. But the bank account, right? The bank account, we remembered to make the class public, but then we forgot to set our private parts to be private. So right now these are package private, which means that if we made a main inside of this class, that it could reach in and muck with these things. But then also if I had made another class, so for example, bank and bank account, we would probably, in the future when we learn about packages, we would have them in the same package. And so the problem is that the bank account, things that should be private right now are package private, which means that bank, if they were in the same package, that bank could reach in and mess with them. And you don't necessarily want that to happen. So we need to make these private. And then the constructors we need to make public, and the getters we need to make public. And but notice here in bank, we remembered to do it. So we were inconsistent with this. So let's go through those and update those. I'm just scrolling through because everything's nicely syntax highlighted. When we go to edit it, we're not going to have that benefit. So, okay. And then our size. So our size class, we remembered here. And so we were good all the way up until we were done with the constructors. And then here on our get and our setters, we forgot to make these public. And then the same thing happened with this item class. We forgot to set it for the privates, and we forgot to set it for the getters and setters. Okay, so that's what I remember us having in session. So let's go and edit that. Oh, and for some of you who maybe this isn't familiar, this is this website's called GitHub. And this is a place where you can put code so that you can have projects that are collaborative together. So for example, here is, let me just pull up just a random project. So you can see I have lots of projects that are going on, but let's pull up one that's sort of recent. So here's a project that I'm working on, and I have 5 different people working on this project. And the idea being is that this is for a website for a downtown map. But the idea being is that there's lots of different kinds. There's Java, there's Python, there's JavaScript, there's HTML. There's all kinds of code that's part of this project. Actually, let's just pull this up. Yeah, so JavaScript, Python, CSS, HTML. And so this is a way that we can collaborate together to be able to work on this one project. And then the idea being is that we can independently, through these things called branches, work independently. And then when we're happy with, maybe I've solved a particular problem, we can then put it in. And so actually I've deleted all my branches because they've all been merged. But the idea being is that individual people can work on their own separate branch, and then when they're happy with whatever they're doing, they can then say, hey, can you pull this into the main code? And that's a merge request, or merge it into the main code. But also it's a useful way of tracking, issues of bugs or features and things like that. So yeah, so GitHub is a really nifty way of being able to collaborate with people. And it's a versioning, it's a version control. So I can say what has happened, what's happened in in the past. So if I ever say like, hey, what did the code look like 3 days ago? I can go back 3 days and see what it looked like. So right here, there were 4 changes that happened 3 days ago. And so if there was something like a regression where things break or we lose features, we can go back in time and figure out where that happened, and we can say, well, what's happened between now and then? And that's very, very useful. Imagine you saving every time you made a change to a file, you save those changes in a separate spot that you could then go back to and find later. That's very much like what this is doing. This is keeping track of differences, and it hashes them, so it gives them text of us explaining what's happening, what are we doing. But then it also gives this nifty little label here that we can use to talk to each other about. So we can just say these last six hex digits and say, oh yeah, in FB214C, we saw that it was working, and then the next commit it broke. So that's that's a little bit about what Git is. If any of you have questions about Git, feel free to ask. I would be happy to do an entire session about Git. But yeah, so that's the environment that we're working in. And I used to have all of the Java examples as separate files on Git on GitHub, but I merged them all into this README file to make it more accessible for students. Okay, so let's go to, so here's Pokemon. So we're gonna say, so, oh, and then those messages that you saw that was explaining commits, that's this down here, this commit changes. So I'm gonna start typing in the changes that I'm making. So update example, and then we'll just say access modifiers. If I can spell. Okay. All right, so this we're gonna make public. And then good there. So then here in the bank account, and so these the bank these make sense to be public or packet, or I might change them to be package protected if I had a project that this belonged to. But right now, the idea being is that this bank could be used by anybody externally could make a bank. I might though change these bank account, some of these bank account things like the constructors to be package private. I might explicitly say that, but for now we're just going to make it public because right now we don't have packages, and because they're separate classes. Okie dokie. Oh, and then we should know how to do this now, because now we've actually had we've learned that material to be able to throw exceptions and then be able to catch them. So for example, bank could catch those exceptions with a try catch. Okay, and we would look through the Java API to see what exception would make sense in that context. All right, so size. Okay, so here we go. Need to make these public. Traditionally, setters setters and getters are going to be public. You might have an internal setter and getter that might be something that's a wrapper or help to help out some other operation that might be private. But in this case, so far in this class, all of our setters and getters have been public. All right, and so these need to be private. And these need to be public. All right. Commit directly, so let's take a look. Okay. So you notice how it's showing us the changes. Gets very nice like that. Normally I'm using get in the terminal. So normally I'm using it here. So so say for example, I'm in so if I could type status. So typically I'd be typing in the terminal like this to using get, but for this example, I'm using this nice, I'm using the website just so that it's more visual, so that it's easier for you to see what's going on. Okay, and occasionally I'll use something called get Kraken. So get Kraken, and so it displays code visually as well. So you see these are all the commits. And then if I wanted to look at changes, so like here's a change to this one file, I could see the changes. Okay, and that's a very outdated repo because I had to boot into 1604 because for some reason my other operating system wasn't working with Zoom this morning. So yeah, like Dropbox crashed. Okay, cool. So yeah, so let's just keep going through this, make sure we've got everything. We forgot our privacy setting for this bank. Hopefully the recording isn't going to clip too bad when I'm scrolling. Okay, yeah, so it looks like we just forgot that one bank. All right. Okay, commit changes. There we go. All updated. So hopefully that was useful for all of you. So yeah, that was access modifiers. So yeah, whenever we're looking at who should have access to what, we should probably think about why, well, who specifically, but then also why, and then what we would set it to. So most of the time, members, variable members should be private, because you don't want somebody reaching in and mucking with it. And even as a best practice, if it's perfectly fine, like it's not going to mess up your program for somebody messing something up, like say it's a name in a string somewhere, you should still probably have a wrapper around it that at least allows you to figure things out. So for example, say that the name did change and you're trying to track down how the name changed. You could very easily put some kind of logging message inside of a setter method. But if you don't have a setter method, then you have no way of knowing who's reached in and messed with a public variable. So it's much better to have a public setter method instead of having a public variable, because it allows you to later put in things to give you some visibility to what's occurring if something strange is occurring. Also, if something crashes, something gets mucked up, the stack trace will show you that method. It'll be included in all of that red text when something bad occurs. So yeah, having more methods is good because it gives you more visibility and gives you if all of your methods, if you break your problem into lots of little tiny parts, they're much easier to test independently of each other. But also, if something crashes, the stack trace is going to be very precise because it's going to tell you where things went wrong, and that's going to be very useful. Okay, so that's that's what I got for you today. I'm going to hang out for a little bit, but that was access modifiers, and that was us going through and fixing / updating our previous activity. But then actually let's take a few seconds to explain why the previous activities worked beforehand. If we recall that this no modifier or package private, most of the time when we were doing examples, all of the stuff in the example that we were doing was inside of main, for example, that was inside of the class. And package private can access all of the stuff inside of all of the private parts inside of the class, or all of the package private stuff inside of the class. So main was able to access stuff that we forgot to put a modifier on because it was given package private. But then when Jeff's robot went to test it, for some of the stuff that people turned in where they've forgotten it, it wasn't able to find them. So that's really, really important. And I'm sorry I wasn't more strict about that earlier. Is that this no modifier, it looks really goofy in your code if you forgot to put modifiers. And most of the time, it's probably not what you want. Because you're able to test it. It works perfectly fine in the scope of your code. Your main is able to access all of the stuff, and it's perfectly fine. But in the moment you go to turn it in, everything breaks. So that's why the previous examples work, because either we weren't testing, so stuff that we forgot to make private, like some of the member variables, we never bothered to go and check to see if they were private. We just assumed they were private and then didn't go in and mess with them. Maybe even when we were using the setters and getters, we never bothered to double check to make sure that they weren't private. So that's why forgetting to make things private and doing this no modifier worked fine, because everything inside the class was still able to access it fine. And the things that were supposed to be public, it worked perfectly fine in the scope of the class. But when something externally went to test it, it would fail because public needs to be accessible to the world, and there was no modifier. Hopefully this chart is good enough. If not, you can always go to this link, and this is in my this is in the, if you go to my GitHub, which there's a link on Jeff's server and also in Slack. if you go here, they have a nice text description of what each of these things is or are. Okay, that's what I got for you. I'll hang out for a few more minutes.